If you were asked to name America's most dangerous wild animal, your mind probably goes somewhere specific. A bear rising up on its hind legs, a mountain lion crouched in the brush, an alligator sliding off a muddy bank, a rattlesnake coiled in dry grass. Those are the animals we're built to fear. Teeth, claws, venom, size. Every instinct we carry tells us these are the things worth watching for in the dark. This is a dark two-lane highway, somewhere in rural America. Forest presses in close on both sides. A car moves through the night, headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the trees. Something steps out of that darkness. Not a predator, a deer. And by the numbers, that animal standing at the edge of the road is connected to more human harm every year than almost any predator on this continent. This isn't a story about a dangerous animal in the way we usually mean that phrase. The white-tailed deer isn't aggressive. It isn't hunting you. It has no interest in you at all. But somehow, an animal most people find genuinely pleasant to look at has become one of the most consequential wildlife problems in the country. Understanding why means understanding something most people get wrong about what dangerous actually means. Start with how we see this animal. White-tailed deer are everywhere in American life, and that familiarity shapes how we react to them. They graze in parks. They wander through suburban yards at dusk. They show up on greeting cards and hunting lodge signs and state wildlife logos. They are, in a real sense, one of the most non-threatening images in American wildlife culture. A mountain lion looks like exactly what it is. A deer doesn't. It has no claws, no venom, nothing built for offense. Everything about its body says prey, not threat. But risk doesn't only come from an animal's ability to attack. Sometimes it comes from something much simpler: how often that animal ends up sharing space with you. And white-tailed deer share space with Americans constantly, because the country built exactly the kind of landscape they thrive in. Roads cut directly through forest, creating exposed edges where deer feed on the new growth that sunlight encourages along the tree line. Farmland borders woodlots. Suburban developments back up against patches of remaining forest, then plant the kind of ornamental shrubs and lawns deer are happy to browse. None of this was designed with deer in mind, but almost all of it works in their favor. Deer are most active at dawn and dusk, exactly the hours when visibility is lowest and commuter traffic is heaviest. A deer standing in roadside brush gives a driver almost no warning before it moves, and a 200-pound animal entering a lane at highway speed leaves only a fraction of a second to react. There's no reliable way to swerve safely around that kind of surprise. That's simple physics, not a flaw in any individual driver. So how big is this problem actually? Insurance and highway safety data put the number of deer vehicle collisions in the United States at somewhere around 1.5 million a year. Though because many minor collisions go unreported, the real total is likely higher. According to the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, those collisions are associated with roughly 200 human deaths and close to 30,000 injuries annually, figures that have shifted somewhat year to year, but stayed in a broadly similar range for over a decade. Federal crash data confirms that animal collisions are a meaningful, if usually overlooked, category of fatal crash, concentrated heavily in the fall, on rural roads, in the hours around dusk. Reviews of fatal animal vehicle crashes have found that the large majority involve deer specifically, more than any other animal by a wide margin. The property damage adds up too, with total costs across the country estimated well into the billions of dollars every year. These aren't the biggest numbers in American public safety. They're not meant to be. What makes them notable is the animal attached to them. Nobody expects a deer to be part of that conversation at all. So why are there so many deer in the first place? The honest answer is more complicated than the simple version people usually repeat. It's not simply that hunting wolves and mountain lions out of the eastern half of the country let deer numbers explode unchecked, although reduced predation pressure in many regions has been part of the picture. White-tailed deer populations collapsed severely across much of the country by the early 20th century. driven down by unregulated market hunting and widespread habitat loss. What brought them back was decades of deliberate conservation and hunting regulation, work that succeeded remarkably well, in some areas succeeding well beyond what anyone originally intended. At the same time, the landscape itself was changing in a way that specifically favored this species. White-tailed deer aren't an animal built for deep, unbroken forest. They're an edge species, adapted to the zone where one habitat type meets another: forest against field, woodlot against lawn, tree line against roadside clearing. American land use, farms carved out of forest, suburbs pushed against woodland, highways threading through both, created an enormous amount of exactly that kind of edge habitat, almost by accident. We didn't simply move into deer country. In an enormous number of places, we accidentally built deer country around ourselves. That's how you end up with a suburban deer population, an animal that can feed in a backyard, cross a residential street, bed down in a strip of trees behind a shopping center, and never once have to interact with the kind of wide, unbroken forest most people picture as its natural home. In many of these areas, natural predators are scarce or absent entirely, and local hunting is limited or restricted altogether, removing two of the primary checks that once kept deer numbers in balance. Wildlife agencies in numerous states now manage deer populations that are, in specific local areas, considerably denser than what the surrounding habitat can comfortably support long-term. The deer isn't invading a separate human world. Deer and people are, in a growing number of places, simply occupying the same landscape on the same schedule, without either species particularly intending to. That overlap is exactly what makes the roads so difficult to fix. Deer become more active during the fall breeding season, when bucks in particular move more widely and less predictably than usual, and collision numbers reliably rise during those months. Add reduced daylight, and a genuinely difficult problem gets harder. Roadside vegetation that deer are drawn to for food can also reduce a driver's sight line at exactly the wrong moment. Some interventions do have real evidence behind them. Dedicated wildlife crossing structures, paired with fencing that funnels animals toward them, have been shown to reduce collisions dramatically in the specific corridors where they're installed. Targeted population management in the most affected areas can meaningfully reduce local collision rates over time. Standard roadside deer crossing signage, on its own, has shown far more limited effect, since a driver's response depends heavily on genuine, moment-to-moment attentiveness rather than a general awareness that deer exist somewhere nearby. None of these tools solve the underlying issue completely, because the underlying issue isn't really about roads at all. It's about how much shared space now exists between deer and people across the country. That shared space creates consequences well beyond collisions. In areas where deer densities run high, sustained browsing can measurably suppress forest regeneration, thinning out the understory plants and young trees that other wildlife depend on, and in some studied areas, changing the composition of the forest itself over time. Agricultural damage from deer feeding on crops is a persistent, documented cost for farmers in many regions. The relationship between deer and tick-borne disease is real, but considerably more complicated than a simple cause and effect. Since ticks depend on a whole chain of host species, and deer are only one part of a more tangled ecological picture. The collision problem, in other words, isn't an isolated statistic. It's one visible symptom of a much larger, ongoing renegotiation between deer and the built environment. So is the white-tailed deer actually America's most dangerous animal? That depends entirely on what you're measuring. If you're counting deliberate attacks, the answer is clearly no. Deer aren't predators, and they aren't seeking out human contact. If you're counting how often an animal is genuinely involved in serious human harm and significant economic cost, at a national scale, year after year, the picture looks very different. And deer land somewhere near the top of that particular list, not because they're vicious, but because of how relentlessly common the encounter is. That's really the whole point of this story. A grizzly bear encounter is rare enough to make headlines. It's frightening precisely because it's unusual. A deer stepping into a roadway happens somewhere in this country several times a minute. It's ordinary enough that almost nobody thinks of it as dangerous at all, right up until the moment it is. Which brings the story back to the animals we started with. Bears, mountain lions, alligators, venomous snakes. We fear them because we understand, intuitively, what their bodies are built to do. But how dangerous an animal actually is to a population depends on more than teeth and claws. It depends on how many of that animal exist, how closely they live alongside us, and how often our paths genuinely cross. The white-tailed deer succeeds, ecologically, because it can live remarkably close to humans without either species fully registering the other as a threat. That closeness is exactly where its real danger lives, not in aggression, but in sheer constant proximity. The car is still moving down that dark highway. The forest is still pressing in on both sides. America's most consequential wildlife danger doesn't always wait somewhere out in the wilderness. Sometimes it's standing quietly at the edge of the road, waiting for a gap in the traffic that never quite comes in time.